Story Chat, where we like to talk about contemporary short stories from this lovely genre with the same rigor and affection as we so often discuss the classics. Joining me this month are stalwarts of the chat, Jay Wolf and Matt Holder. In case somebody's new first episode experience, whatever. Jay, why don't you quickly introduce yourself, and then Matt, you do the same.
Hi, I am Jay Wolf. I'm an editor and author in the general science fiction community, and I write books under the nom de guerre M. Daniel McDowell.
And I'm Matt. I write reviews for Strange Horizons, where you can find some of my stuff, as well as other places. I also write fiction as well.
And I remain Oliver Brackenbury, editor of Edge Sword Sorcery, podcaster of So I'm Running a Novel, currently on hiatus while I finish the outline for the novel. And I'm the guy whose voice you're hearing when you're not hearing Jay or Matt. True story. So this month's story, it comes from Tales from the Magician's Skull, issue number 7, which is notable for a couple of reasons. One of them being that it was the first issue of the magazine where the stories were chosen through open submissions. The first 6, plus I guess the issue 0 they had, were all direct commissions. So that's kind of neat. The table of contents is a bit more, I guess you could say, random. And within it is somebody who had not showed up in the magazine before, author Mark Rigney, who wrote the story we're going to discuss today, Dara's Tale. I chose Dara's Tale for our discussion this month, probably because it stuck with me. I still think about it now and again, which I read a lot of short stories, and I can't say that for a lot of them. Also, it was one I just enjoyed enough that I did that thing that all authors, I think, wish people did more, which is I just sent a little email saying to the author saying how much I liked it. Just realized I was kind of patting my own back there. I'm a saint. I'm getting choked up on my own heroism here for sending an email. But anyway, you get the idea. The point is it stuck with me, and I thought it was neat and nifty. And we're going to go deeper on this. But in a nutshell, I thought it was worth discussing aside from just quality, because it felt to me kind of like a good possible answer to a question I've asked myself a few times while thinking about what we can do in the genre that hasn't been done a lot before, if not never before, which in this case is, what would young adult sword and sorcery look like? Young adult is a clear age categorization, not the sort of loosey-goosey usage we get sometimes, which I think Jake could probably speak to better than me, where YA is kind of a genre unto itself. Like, would you say that's right, Jay, that YA kind of gets abused these days and often just means like a kind of specific genre reading for anybody of any age, not so much like young adults?
It's definitely a category in which people have sort of, and I think this is actually like more of a marketing problem than it is like an authoring or like publishing problem specifically. Is that it's sort of a basket into which a lot of things have been thrown, and some of those things are not actually like young adult oriented fiction. It's also like there's a kind of aggressive gendering that goes with it, which is that
it almost feels like made female somehow, even though there's no reason to do that.
Well, it's kind of more insidious than that. What it is that a lot of people who happen to be women or are presented as in a feminine light in the kind of like broader, and this happens a lot in science fiction and fantasy specifically, because a lot of the tropes of certain types of science fiction and fantasy have kind of become tropes of YA in like an inadvertent, like not actually intended way. But yeah, so what happens is that authors who are perceived as women or as feminine will get categorized as YA to deleterious effect if their stories are not actually YA. And so then this causes this sort of weird feedback loop where like a female author will come out and say like, hey, my book's not actually YA. Please stop putting it on YA lists. This is very bad. It happens especially, I think personally, like having observed it, it happens a lot with authors that are otherwise marginalized also. So like a lot of queer authors and a lot of BIPOC authors have a tendency to get lumped into YA as a means of making them seem less serious, which is kind of insidious in my point of view. Anyways, that was a really long diatribe.
No, that was not a diatribe. That was a nice answer to my question. Thank you. I appreciated your thoroughness, and honestly, I feel like we go deeper on it because it is Yeah, it is definitely seems to be pardon me. It does definitely seem to be used as like a diminishing term for the most part, at least in casual conversation that I see online. And yeah, like it makes me think about how correct me if I'm wrong, I'm a little tired, but I feel like in years past, often works written by women would be miscategorized sometimes as being romance or romance adjacent, even if they weren't, just because, wow, look who's
Yep.
writing it. And it
Yep.
feels
And
like this, yeah,
that's more. It's basically this. It's the same problem with a slightly different hat.
that's what I was going to say.
So
It feels like the update of
yeah,
that kind
yeah,
of.
the modernization.
Progress question mark? No. I'm curious, Matt. Have you ever run into this phenomenon, like in your reading or perhaps in your teaching, even just the way the students see things?
Now the students don't read books, so they don't know. But no, I worked at a public library for about 4 years, which is also where you'll see a lot of the genre stuff. I don't know, like I mean, I'm not that old. I'm 30, and so but even like when I grew up, I don't feel like YA was like becoming a thing because it sort of became a thing with the popularity of Harry Potter and the Hunger Games and Twilight,
Mhm.
and those were like coming out when I was in middle school, high school, etc. But I never, so I don't feel like I ever personally read YA as a young adult because that it didn't quite exist. Um, I think
Yeah,
it
I had
also
the same
goes sort of
experience with
hand in
that.
hand. There's like the stereotype. I mean, it is about boys. They don't read as much as girls, and so I think that plays into it as well. And I think that's only true up until a certain age. Like most kids like to read up until middle school, and then it kind of goes away. And part of that might be all this like sort of gender dynamic of like aggressively marketing what's considered YA specifically toward women and because like I'd be hard pressed I think to name off the top of my head sort of YA authors that are specifically targeted toward males. I don't know. I know
Yeah, and
Yeah,
Brandon
like,
that's
Sanderson
actually a
has
big
YA
problem.
stuff. Uh,
mhm.
I mean, there are other series that have been around since before I think YA was a thing. Like the Ranger's Apprentice series are still very popular. Those are categorized as YA now. The Gwen's books are categorized as YA now. Um, and
Yeah,
there's
I
some
think
other
of
ones.
her as like proto YA. It's like you can say they're aimed at that age group, but they are not of the quote unquote YA genre, like tropes and all this of the rest that come about as it's become more than just like an age range for categorization. Yeah,
Yeah,
and it's funny as you're saying that. Like I'm thinking this would be kind of a regression, but like we don't have any. If we went back to this, but we don't have what you maybe see in decades past of like boys' adventure. Like I feel like sometimes you go back to the 50s and 60s and even 70s. With SNS's heyday in the second wave, and you see very much marketing reading to boys, to male presenting kids. So we just said boys back then. Um, so it's like I don't know if the answer is to now bring that back because that would be also forcing like a gender binary and all this stuff. That's a bit, yeah. But like man, what do we do, right? Well, that's a bigger question, and we could of course spend a whole hour just on that. But I just thought it'd be neat to sort of set the stage by kind of walking around these issues. Um, Before we dive into Dara's Tale by Mark Rigney, who I think I can reasonably infer from my brief conversation with him and his web presence, etc., is a fella, and is written in quote unquote the masculine genre. So before I get into it myself, Matt, why don't you share with us your general impressions of the story, and then Jay, you follow, and then we'll come back to me.
so I really I enjoyed this one. I had not read it before. I've not read anything by this author before. Um, the first time through, or I've only read this thing once, but I was struck by so it's a story that is sort of about stories, which is a very kind of popular thing, but I think it is doing something a little bit more interesting with it in terms. I mean, there's the reading, the sort of like almost. I mean, there's almost like kind of saccharine reading of this where sort of the because it's like what every sort of English teacher wants people to get out of literature, which is like this sense of inspiration and how stories can change you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that sort of happens at the end. But there's also the other side, the more insidious thing of whatever his name, like the Trump analog guy,
Oh,
the demagogue,
Garland.
Garland. Like he comes in, he's telling them a story too, and he's telling them a story that they sort of didn't know that they wanted to hear, and which is just as dangerous, perhaps even more so than like the little girl that reads the fairy story and feels inspiration to murder the guy. But I like that sort of how Rigney presents sort of both. He juxtaposes these two sort of quote unquote power of narrative themes. And the other thing that I was struck by, and I looked at Rigney's website. He seems to mostly be a playwright, and I think that that knowing that and reading this, I could feel a lot in the sense of how sort of tightly structured I felt like it was. Like he sort of introduces things and he pays them off, and everything, there's like an economy to the storytelling and stuff, sort of, like when you think dramas and plays are very formal and very structured, and stuff has to get set up and paid off, and I feel like he does that really well at several stages in this. Peter also is constantly doing the play within a play thing, which is he's doing here as well, sort of, because the whole narrative, right, is basically playing out the brief fairy tale we get at the end. Garland being the sorcerer character that comes in and corrupts everything and draws the hero to him, not realizing that she is able to resist his powers or whatever. But yeah, I'm sure I'll have other things to say about it, but those are the things that sort of immediately stuck out to me and the things that I kind of enjoyed about it.
Right on. How about you, Jay?
Yeah, I really liked that he did the story within a story, and I'm glad to know that the playwright thing came up, because that was definitely something I noticed also, is that not just the economy of materials, but sort of like he very much does the Chekhov's gun with a prop in the story very, very early on. That's just sort of like, yep, that's coming up later. um, One of the things that I noticed about it is that it's sort of a unique presentation of like sort of a mixture of the Emperor's New Clothes meets like an interpretation of like the boiling frog fable narrative that isn't actually true. Like if you put a frog into a pot and slowly boil it, it'll still jump out. But that narrative, that narrative idea is really like interesting to explore, because as humans we have a very high tendency to stay in dangerous situations much longer than we should. And so like you can see the danger and terror closing in around this community that's being walled off. And yeah, I did notice also the very obvious Trump analog in the building the wall element of this. I feel like we're going to see a lot of that in the analysis of contemporary science fiction in general, and in this particular story it was kind of hard to miss. But yeah, I really liked the way I think in particular I just really liked the way he captured like a sort of like tween aged girls world. Like I was actually really impressed by that. Like it's not easy to do that with verisimilitude, and I feel like he carried it off. And I think part of that is just like the story economy overall, just like it's very simple, it's very direct, the language is not overly florid. It's compelling and convincing. And that was, I think, what really like stuck with me throughout the reading, was just sort of like, yeah, this makes sense. Like of course this would be the outcome. Um yeah, I think that would be my initial impressions.
Yeah, yeah, well, as I said earlier, I really enjoyed it, and a lot of things you guys mentioned also played into my enjoyment of it. Tight structure, there's no overly obvious Chekhov's gun. I must admit, I didn't initially see the pen being put to that use at the end. Spoilers, by the way, these are always spoiler-heavy things, but the pen is mightier than the sword, question mark, at the end. She kills the wizard by driving it into the wizard's neck. Luckily, I think the way it was written was not as ham-fisted as I just exclaimed it. And that's another thing about the story that I feel sometimes belies skill in writing, when if you as a reader just kind of describe, moments in it, broadly speaking, or the base elements, it can sound kind of like, yeah, whatever. But then you read it and you go, oh, okay, actually, yeah, that all ties together really nicely. And so, yeah, the idea of like these competing narratives and killing the wizard with the pen, like I say, I could just come away with it with a corny pen is mightier than the sword routine. But because that moment comes right at the end, and it doesn't feel too telegraphed, and we get there through a journey that gives a sense of a fleshed out world, big enough as it needs to be. I wouldn't say there was capital W world building going on here. Um, and with a character who feels, like a real person, not just someone's vague idea of a tween girl. I think it's earned. At the end, I was kind of like, yeah, all right, feels good. All right, stab him with that pen.
Oh, I wouldn't say it was problematic. I felt it was like it was more like a playwright's idea of inevitability rather than like, oh, this is obvious. Like it was just like there's something going to happen here, but it wasn't like it was like
Pardon me, I gotcha.
done
Yeah, exactly.
poorly.
That's what I mean. Like in the reading, it works. I guess I'm saying sometimes I try.
Completely
Do you ever
agree.
find you trying? I think we're finally agreeing.
Yeah.
Because it's like sometimes I try and describe a story to someone, and if I just go with the base elements, like there's a time traveling robot and trying to protect a kid from another time traveling robot, it can sound really stupid. But then you watch Terminator 2, and it's great. So So in a similar vein, I guess, like I say, the murdering the villain with a pen at the end after the sword doesn't work could sound like a really corny pen is mightier than the sword thing. But anyway, it works. I'm belaboring this point. Um, yeah, I also kind of liked how it did feel potentially in dialogue with the whole YA as it's been thing that we were discussing earlier of the last, let's call it 15 years. If only because, we do have a teenage girl who has a bow, which thanks to Katniss, I feel is particularly seen as a young female protagonist weapon nowadays. And absolutely, of course, is coming off of like reading about a character who's aspirational in essentially, her period and setting, YA story. So I thought that was kind of neat because when I read it for the first page the first time, I was kind of like, oh, is this going to get like all metacritical or whatever? But I think in the end, it just was whether or not Mark intended it. It sort of put me in the mind of thinking about contemporary, YA fantasy adventure, and then we read the story, which I feel very firmly hits all the classic notes of capital S sword and sorcery. I'm curious, Matt, did this feel like a sword and sorcery story to you? I know we so often run into this tedious purity test kind of conversation online, so that's not what I'm going for. I just, did it give you that vibe?
I think so. Yeah, like it had it even had the wizard and the tower elements, and it felt very like fit within the genre to me. It was very sinister. I really didn't pick up too much on the sort of YA vibes, which is part of me not being very familiar with the genre in the first place. I was reminded of there's a story that Samuel Delaney has in his collection Tales in Navirion, which in which like an older woman sort of explains to this younger girl like basically how the world works, and they explain the origins of writing and money and capitalism and all these things. And this feels like one of those kind of like moral fable tales, almost more like in the Le Guin sort of vein. Someone like Ged sort of feels close, like maybe a closer analog to Danica. Or, but yeah, I mean, it had the elements. It had the sort of the sinister magic, the very sort of the selfishness of the sorcerer, and then the sort of hero being someone who is sort of subversive in the sense that she's not a big muscly barbarian. And she ultimately, like, there's a kind of rejection in some ways of like the ethic of a lot of sort of sorcery in the end, which is her sort of rejection of her weapons, which I'm not exactly sure if it works precisely because she just uses the pen to stab the guy. But
Yeah, like I feel like if it was more of a Le Guin type YA story, she would have defeated his narrative with a counter
yeah, she
narrative.
would
She
not
would have
have done the
swayed
violence
people.
thing. She would have been more sort of canny than that. But in some ways, perhaps the form demands some sort of. I mean, that's like fairy tales have these really violent ends because they're telling these like moral stories. And so in some ways it's sword and sorcery, but maybe it's also more trying to be a sort of contemporary fairy tale about demagogues and sort of the power of narrative.
I definitely feel like she, I always think of Brian Murphy's List, and definitely I felt like most of that got ticked off here. I mean, she's got more heroic motivations, but I would definitely say she was an outsider by the back end of the story. You kind of, she sort of stands apart at the beginning just because of, her interests and so on. But by the end, she's practically the only person in town who hasn't bought into the narrative. So she becomes an outsider over the course of it. And that felt very SNS to me. Plus the bloody deed at the end, right? Ultimately resolving it with violence. How about you, Jay? How did the SNSness of it all strike you? As someone from the more Elric school, as we've discussed in the past.
Yeah, I mean, actually, for me, this was kind of like a lot of the elements of this felt very kind of like bog standard dark fantasy, and like I need to highlight like that. I mean, that's highly favorable for me. um, like it had kind of, who I was kind of thinking about while I was reading this is Lloyd Alexander, actually.
I can see
Um,
that, yeah.
because Taryn is such a pain in the butt in the early books of that series, but you get where he's coming from, and you get like why he's such a kind of a pain. And it's largely just that he has all these big ideas in his head, and he doesn't have any filter for them. And I feel like it's pretty similar with Danica, actually. Like she has all like she sees this thing that's happening around her and nobody else is seeing it, and it's making her feel very crazy. And unfortunately that actually like is very relatable for me as a person who grew up like in a rural small town and was like, often the only person going like, actually that, new public policy in the school is probably kind of prejudicial. Just sort of like having to be like the only person seeing something is a feeling that I've had a lot before. Anyways, so like as far as that goes, that whole thing kind of came together very nicely for me. I don't usually adhere to that particular rubric, so I don't remember all of the specific pieces of it. But for me, this felt absolutely like something I would class as sword and sorcery. I I don't have any objections to that.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Like I said, I'm just curious to get your
Oh yeah,
reads on
no,
it,
it,
not
it
to
just
engage in the Furies
definitely
testing.
squarely hit the mark for me as far as that goes.
Yeah, I had to think about it a little bit for myself, but yeah, I think ultimately it struck that for me too. Like I say, she is ultimately kind of an outsider in her community.
Mhm.
You could definitely say it's historically inspired, if only because the kind of thing that happens in the story keeps happening
I was
throughout
gonna say
history.
it's like mystifyingly contemporary, frankly, but
Yeah, well,
in
glances
a
nervously at various
charming way.
places. And actually, that brings me, yeah. So yeah, and it has some sort of horrific elements. I mean, okay, giant ants, we've seen them before, but that would be really scary if you were a tween with a, small sword, etc.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think ultimately it hits enough of Brian's 7 points, and that's all he ever says. In case you're not familiar, listener, it just has to hit enough for you personally to feel, yeah, this hits it. So yeah, um, coming back to the topicalness of, is it Trump? Is it something else, going on here with the whole narrative of a charismatic fraud? Although this guy can actually do some sorcery, coming in and taking over community and making them afraid of their neighbors and building that wall and all that good stuff. Like, is it very contemporary or is it timeless? And how
Maybe both.
where does it sit on the ham-fistedness scale to you? Well, let's start with you, Matt. How did you feel? Did it sort of was it kind of like, yeah, yeah, I know, I'm living it, buddy, or was it like, yeah, this has been happening a long time?
I think it is both. It feels, I mean, definitely like demagogues have been around since people. I mean, that's a term that comes from classical Greek, and they were very conscious of the danger of the demagogue and the tyrant. Um, I think there are just a lot of sort of because so many of these sort of fascistic things are happening now, it just feels very contemporary, like building the walls, forming the militias, disbanding the militias, gaining the monopoly of force, and then banning books, and basically like trying to depersonalize what this community had previously. Like she finds a sorcerer at the end in his like chamber, and he's like gathered about him all of the like personal effects of the people.
Yeah.
So he's like stripped them of their identity and turned them into like this sort of mass, which is like a fascistic tendency is to sort of gesture toward this kind of you say you're doing it, you appeal to like a shared commonality in people, and you appeal to like a certain type of fear of outsiders and intolerance, and then in so doing you sort of like work to depersonalize and disrupt the community building, which is often consists of a lot of difference actually. um, but no, I mean it feels contemporary just because again these things are happening. But I don't know if I would say it felt ham-fisted, at least not immediately. I don't know. I mean, it's definitely like very obvious that this is like a moral tale, and if you're one of those people that doesn't like your fiction to have a point of view about politics, then I could see this not being for you because Rigney is really clear that like this is bad, and there's a certain segment of reader that doesn't want to be told that bad things are bad. But Rigney is sort of, you know, again, he's if you're doing the fairy tale thing, you got to satisfy the sort of convention that those things have like a right and wrong morality to them. Honestly, I feel like if there's something was ham-fisted, I do think it's sort of his approach to the story, the power of story. Like there's the like the cynic in me is sort of like rolls my eyes at the kind of idea of the sort of this is kind of like the liberal sort of impulse to say that like oh literature will like teach you empathy and it will make you you know a greater sympathy for people that aren't like you. And like you want to believe that obviously, but the reality is it's not quite that simple. Like it's more complicated than that. And I mean, if somebody reads Grapes of Wrath, they're not going to come out the other side a communist. That's just not how it goes. And they're also probably going to still think that all this like capitalist exploitation is fine and not do anything about it. So if anything were ham-fisted, I would feel like maybe like that element was perhaps like Rigney. I think just believes more strongly than I do in the in the power of like the word or whatever. Although again, I do like that you know the story that Garland is telling is just as influential and insidious. And honestly, I believe more in that power than I do in reading a fairy tale and feeling inspired to resist. Unfortunately, but that's just sort of my own outlook.
No, that's fair. That's fair. I mean, yeah, you keep making me think of a line from it, which was, I believe, the bullshit that was fed to the local woman who had her books taken by Garland, which was, when people start believing what they read, stories kill. And I was like, stories
Mm-hmm.
don't kill. Tween girls with a pen kill. But
Mm-hmm.
but you know, it's like, yeah, I don't know where to take that sentence because it's presented as BS from the wizard.
I think like it cuts both ways. Like I think, and I
Yeah,
think that's sort of what's interesting about it. Like, uh, when people hear that, you know, that others are bad and we should defend ourselves from them, like that's the story that's been told for decades and centuries and millennia, to sort of the justification. And it's that, and unfortunately, it's that easy. All you have to do is point at someone else and say them, and they will kill those people. Like it's not that hard, and it like that's it's believable that this guy could roll up and they don't know who he is, and suddenly he has all this power. Um, we're very like emotionally scared creatures, and we so you know stories in that sense, like there is a sense of stories kill. I don't necessarily believe again the inverse of that, you know, the sort
yeah.
of the kind of this is somewhat like fabricated but also slightly true, but like people always will look at a book like Uncle Tom's Cabin and be like, oh look, this work of literature made like a significant material difference in the lives of people because Abraham Lincoln was so moved, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's like, well, maybe a little bit perhaps, but I mean also there's a lot of other stuff going on. And again, the reality is that not everybody that reads X book is suddenly going to, be transformed. But again, I also have books in my life where I think about me reading them and actually like confronting and thinking about what I believe. So, I don't know.
Yeah, it's a mixed bag. I mean, you also made me think of, I think it was Upton Sinclair who wrote The Jungle, all about the meatpacking industry in the States, and in theory, the president at the time, whose name escapes me, but it was early
Yes, that is
1900s.
the other one that is often like, yeah, thrown out there. That one, The Jungle, Silent Spring by Rachel Carson.
Yes. And yeah, I think once in a while they can have an influence, but maybe it's so that they come along at the right moment. As like you said, a lot of other things are happening as well, right? And it all kind of connects together. And gosh, I wish I had this off the tip of my tongue. I feel like when you were talking about empathy and literature and the sort of the instinct to believe that this is the ultimate way to teach it, um, Jay, I feel like of the three of us, maybe you're the most in touch with like what are they talking about in the literary channels and scenes. Am I wrong, or was there not a kind of pushback on that idea a year or two ago? Wasn't
I'll
there
push
like
back on which idea? I'm sorry.
sorry, the idea of empathy and art and literature in particular being the way to teach people empathy and that being like the big answer.
Oh
And
yeah.
I it was pushed back and framing it as kind of like not useless, but don't push it as a
I feel like
panacea.
I feel like that's actually one of those things that's sort of like an omnipresent capital D discourse, and it's
Mm,
not one I particularly like because I don't feel like fiction is a zero-sum game.
yeah.
I feel like some fiction is going to be there just to like tell you a fun story, and some fiction is going to be there to like make you think. But I don't necessarily like think that that's I don't think that that's necessarily like a function we should like expect out of everything, and expecting every story to have a moral or expecting every story to like translate some element of our daily life into like a meaningful bite-sized piece. Like I don't particularly think that's a good healthy way to look at fiction. I think that like fiction is a lens, and that lens can be turned on anything and toward anyone and used in a way that might be very enlightening, but it also can be used to like manipulate people in the same way that any story can be used to manipulate people. And so like that's not unique to fiction, but I don't know. As far as that kind of stuff goes, it's definitely like kind of an omnipresent ongoing discourse, and it happens I would say it happens more with stories that people perceive as not having the right morals, and I'm going to be like using big quote marks around the right morals.
Yeah.
Um and so that kind of element, I honestly like that's never something I'm personally looking for out of a story, although yeah, like I can't think of anything off the top of my head where I was like, "Wow, you know what's really wrong with that story is it's so amoral." Um, it's
Yeah,
just
I
not
don't think I've
really a
ever read a
problem I
story and been
have.
like, this has no opinions.
I mean,
And
well, the thing is
that's
that a story that doesn't have any opinions isn't very interesting, and so that's
yeah.
why very seldom do those get published. The thing is that, a story should have an opinion, and that opinion may or may not be right, but I think the bigger picture is sort of like eh, the words are kind of escaping me at the moment, unfortunately. I would say that like I I don't like the idea that like all fiction has to espouse a narrative that I agree with. Um it may be that it's espousing something I personally do not agree with, and therefore I don't, engage with it personally. But as far as this story goes, I didn't feel like there was anything so ham-fisted about it that I couldn't like relate with the bigger picture. And I
Mhm.
think that that's partially because the framework of the story is sort of very, again, as we sort of discussed earlier, like the language is very straightforward. Like there's not like a lot of hidden meaning in the words, if that makes sense. Like it's very
Yeah.
direct, and I don't feel like there's a lot of double meaning or anything like that going on. Um, I think that directness can read as like potentially very political if the message, maybe don't listen to the man behind the curtain, is a problem that you have. Like,
Yeah. Like, I enjoy being manipulated and lied to. Yeah, no.
right, right. I mean, honestly, the problem is that some people do not mind that.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I really, yeah, it's interesting because the I just want entertainment, no messages, get that out of my story here. thing. I have found myself encountering that a little bit more in the sword and sorcery scene than elsewhere, which is interesting. Even going back, of course, to the I believe I've mocked them on here before. Lynn Carter's opening to Conan the Buccaneer, where he's like, if you just want to take a break from thinking about taxes and Spiro Agnew, and then read this Conan story. And I'm like, oh, Spiro Agnew. So like it's literally like a selling angle. If you look for it in various corners over the years of SNS, I think mainly second wave onward.
Oh yeah,
And
well, I mean
I
the other thing that you're kind of tipping your toes around is the puppies thing of like, we just want ripping good yarns free of politics, and it's like
well, if I
that's
may be
not
so
a
bold,
thing that's not a thing that can exist in
yeah,
science fiction and
if I may
fantasy.
be so bold, fuck that lot. And also,
Thank you.
but also, I don't even think we need to specifically think about those characters who tend to be operating in bad faith, blah blah. Like, let's just
Oh
think about
yeah, no,
people in a broader sense.
I'm just saying in the sense of the people who have tried to politicize the idea that a story has no politics, which is
Right,
sort of
right.
just like, of course the story has politics, like every person has politics.
Yeah, no, I feel like sorry, just in the chat, Kevin's saying it. It's the Streisand effect. By telling everyone not to think of Spiro Agnew, you see Spiro everywhere in Conan the Buccaneer. All right, I'm gonna go back and I'm gonna reread that book, and I'm gonna see if I can like reframe Thothamon in an essay as essentially being a Spiro Agnew stand-in. But anyway, I, the Canadian, will do this. But yeah, sorry to come back to what we were saying. Um, see, I think we don't even have to go as far as refuting that sort of willfully disruptive, bad faith crowd. I mean, there are people who don't associate with that at all, who would still feel like, yeah, come on, man, just give me a cool sword fight and so on. And my thing is, it's interesting if you look at it that way. Then, in a sense, this is a story where it's kind of a conflict of between forms, because you have sword and sorcery where there's only supposed to be adventure in quotation marks. I say this, and you have the fairy tale, which pretty much by definition, fairy tales are ways of conveying moral instruction. So, is there a conflict here? And I personally would say no, because I firmly believe that there might be surface and below the surface messaging, right? I mean, I don't like these word politics. So I find that word gets very messily applied in these things. But yeah, there's definitely like opinion, point of view, whatever, coming from the author, whether it's all surface or all below surface or some mixture, because every single thing you do in a story is a choice. Every single thing you do. And those choices are informed by who you are. And who you are is a collection of life experiences and opinions and so forth. So I think it is inescapable. And it's why I tend not to even, I mean, I'm having fun doing it with you here, because
Right.
this is all good. We're good faith. We're doing it on purpose. But if someone were just like ambush me in a chat and be like, hey, what do you think about this message? The message is politics. Or I just wouldn't, I would just say either a very brief version of what I'm saying now, which is like, I don't think it's possible. Like, you'd have to have a story written by a void to have something without some kind of message in it. Even if that message is just like, I, the author, have chosen to make this story entirely about white guys, and there's nobody else in this world. And I didn't think very hard about that because I just wanted to write a cool, fun adventure. But yeah, like there's still something coming through there. So yeah, I think the story, for me, the whole warning against strongmen and demagogues and all that good stuff, I felt it was ultimately timeless. Weirdly, I didn't even actually think of Trump when the build that wall situation came into the story, because I just was like, yeah, well, that's what these types always do. They always do everything they can to physically and socially, separate everybody. So it just made sense to me, I guess, without having driving my mind to contemporary events, although it's not a big leap. And I think that's part of what I liked about it in my reading, my take on it. It was the timeless feeling of it. It felt like a good fairy tale moral woven into a story that had all the elements that I tend to look for in a sword and sorcery tale. And so this ultimately gave me hope that this is a direction which could be explored further. Now, are there stories in the canon that would read as kind of like YA SNS? None that come to mind, but I don't have literally every sword and sorcery story ever published on the tip of my tongue. So, listener, if you hear this and you think of something that might be interesting for us to check out in the vein of, classic or maybe another contemporary sword and sorcery story that's like YA question mark, please put it in the comments under the YouTube upload, or, email us at New Edge Sword and Sorcery, either go to the contact form on the website. Yeah, just whatever, hit us up somehow, because I think that's a direction that has certainly been not mined as heavily as others in the genre. And when we come back to the overall question that helped give birth to this very magazine, how do we get more, young diverse readers? How do we expand the audience? I often think like, well, if we could figure out YA for like the middle grade and teenage set reliably, that would be pretty cool. And I mean, some of it can just be the classic stories and the contemporary stories. I mean, I certainly read all kinds of bloody and thunderous things when I was 13, 14, 15, whatever. But I also wonder about like writing stuff really specifically for that audience. So to that, maybe we'll go through our last few minutes here. Matt, do you think there's any need or opportunity perhaps in writing more sword and sorcery stories that are broadly speaking in the vein of what Mark Rigney's done to try and get to those audiences?
I think so. Yeah, I mean, whatever you gotta do. I mean, I'm always going to be in favor of authors that feel. I mean, I don't know. I go back and forth with myself a lot because on the one hand, I want a writer to have a point of view, but at the same time, there's like the literary critic part of me that also enjoys like ambiguity, and there's a sort of tension between like what I want to see in like the material world, which is often unambiguous, and what I enjoy aesthetically, which is usually ambiguous. Not always, but anyway. So I think there's definitely like I mean, even if the effect of just making people angry, because I think that also attracts people to a genre. So if you want to write stories that you know are gonna even make people mad. And I was just reading this the Death Is No Obstacle book by Michael Moorcock. Or it's not by him. It's a long interview with him, and he has this comment about how a lot of times some of the greatest genre stories come from people that are kind of tired of the genre and they're kind of mad at it for a certain reason, and so then they try to push it somewhere else. And I think and I don't know, I'm not saying that like Rigney is like that he was consciously trying to do that, although maybe a little bit. Um, Playwrights tend to be a bit more like anarchic than other other types of writers. Um, but I think it's a good gesture, and I think it's a good impulse. Which isn't to say that like, and people often misinterpret that to think, oh, that you hate this or whatever. And it's like, no, you want to see it do something else because it's been doing the same thing forever, and you want to try and widen it. And again, I don't know if I don't like. I just to me this we keep talking about YA, but I'm thinking about like I just this is in the Tales from the Magician's Skull, which, unless I'm mistaken, is not at all marketed toward any kind of YA audience. So
Well, if I can interrupt for 2 seconds, I will say I do know that Howard Andrew Jones has made a point of trying to keep the magazine approximately PG-13 because he would like younger readers to read it and for parents to be comfortable giving it to them.
I mean, that's nice. I hope many parents bought this for their children. But yeah, I just so on that hand, I think his use of a child is really more of the sort of wanting to play in the fairy tale space than it is I don't know, but that's rambling at this point. But to answer your question, no, I think there's plenty of room, obviously, for difference in both audience and storytelling and form and type and genre and all that stuff.
But do you think, is it something where it would be worth trying to specifically target that age group? Or is it just like, no, just get, the classics and contemporary stuff also written for adults in the hands of that age group?
I don't know. Like, I struggle with if you're gonna like try to target a specific audience with something. I mean, there's a part of that I think could work. I don't know. That's always such a strange thing, especially because YA is so ambiguous in terms of what it's even trying to do. Like if you were to ask me about middle grade, I think that's something that I could think about more concretely to think, oh yeah, then you would want someone who is going to approach this in a very specific way for a very specific audience. But with YA, that crossover is so just kind of
Okay,
vague.
well,
Like I don't
let's stay
know.
focused then. How would, in brief, off the top of the dome here, how would you hit up middle grade? How would you, if you were tasked with writing a middle grade sword and sorcery story?
Well, I'd go out and read a bunch of middle grade stuff, which is usually short, so it gives you your word count, whatever that is. I don't know, like 40,000 words. It tells you who your protagonists are, which are young 12-year-olds. Um, they always got to have some like plucky companions or whatever. And so I don't know. I think like if you look at some of the stuff that's being done in those spaces right now, like there's like that Wings of Fire, the Dragon series. That's not like Sword and Sorcery, but kids love that stuff. Percy Jackson, like,
Hmm.
which is, I mean, that's middle grade. Like some people might call it YA, but it's not. Um, like you've got your friends. You probably said it in some school, which I hate, but like kids are in school, so you know that that's
It's
what they
relatable
relate
to
to.
them, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So I don't know. I guess that would those are just off the top of my head. But see, if you were to ask me for YA, I wouldn't know exactly. Like I don't know. Just I don't
No,
know because I'm not
that's
exactly
fair.
sure who the readership is for YA necessarily. Because a lot, like when you're a teenager, I don't want someone to go take me to the YA section necessarily. Like I would rather just go read, I don't know, and like just take me over to the sci-fi section, like
Yeah, I mean, I as a horrible old wizened crone of 41, none of this existed when I was that age. I just raided the spec fic section and read whatever the heck I could get my hands on. I mean, there were books targeted at younger readers, and I do remember enjoying one author, Martin Godfrey, and a couple others. But certainly, it was just a side effect of me liking reading that I stumbled across those authors. It wasn't like my parents took me to like, okay, well, you're 10, so we got to take you to this shelf, or librarians were like, okay, you're 10, you're only allowed to go over this shelf. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know. It's a tricky one. I don't think parents are necessarily doing that now, but the marketing departments maybe are kind of trying to do that.
Yeah, almost
Um,
all of it is marketing, which is really the frustrating part of it, is that, like, most of what's happening there is not really organic growth. It's inorganic, and that's part of why it's so hard to nail down those audiences, because there's nothing kids hate more than inauthenticity. They
yep.
smell a fake like nothing else, and if they think you are fake, they think you are inauthentic, they don't want anything to do with you. And so like that's really the difficult part of hitting that audience really well. I also would like to point out that like part of what that the growth that you're maybe not seeing is that that growth exists in different subgenre classifications. Like I would be willing to bet there's something that gets classed as YA that would technically fit all of our parameters for Sword and Sorcery that's targeted at a young adult audience. But it's not being marketed to us. It's being marketed to 15 to 25-year-old women. And so
Which is
like
what I tend to think of when I think of, yeah, what quote unquote YA is
that is
a category.
basically, and the thing is that YA as a genre is sort of like the stories that tend to be classed there are no longer really kind of limited to teenagers, and so that's why that's kind of difficult now, is that the classification new adult, which is where the like stories of like 18 to 21-year-olds used to
Right.
go,
And there's new
that
adult as
was like
well.
a 2-year there was like a 2-year fad where the term new adult was being used for that, and then after that that terminology kind of disappeared, and all of those stories got funneled into the grand canon of YA, with big quotation marks around it. And so like I think that part of what we're running up against here is that this stuff probably exists somewhere, and we're just not seeing it because it's not being marketed to someone who likes science, like specifically like sword and sorcery, science fiction, and fantasy stories.
Now I'm just imagining my new adult barbarian story about a barbarian leaving for college or something. Anyway,
I
but
mean, I I mean, there's probably room for it on the shelf, I'm just saying.
yeah.
But yeah, like a lot of that type of storytelling, and to kind of like tag along with what Matt was saying in terms of like, yeah, a lot of those stories take place in a school or educational setting. Like middle grade leading into YA, there's definitely kind of like there's like a runway and then there's a cliff. And like I think that we're losing a lot of readers at that cliff. I've read a lot about how specifically like young, like teenage boys and that general crowd is kind of like being pushed out of the library a little bit because there's not as much stuff that is current that is made for them. And that kind of sucks. And that's sort of like if there's any spot that I would say is like, well, that's a gap we could immediately fill. Um, I would say
Yeah.
that like YA in terms of like, big quotation marks where it's like middle grade YA, um, that's I would say like something that's on that borderline where like you're attracting readers that are probably like 13 to 17. But the problem is that you're not even at that point, you're not even competing against other books. You're competing against like Fortnite and other video games and, Snapchat and every other app that's on their phone. Like you're competing against a lot of things that are not books. So
Yeah, I
trying
mean,
to capture that and also be authentic, that's a tall order.
yeah, I mean, I'd like to think there's ways of working around that, but now we're spiraling out to sort of bigger publishing things. I mean, would a gaming time fiction be considered right for boy readers? Kevin's putting into the chat here. 40K, D&D, Star Wars, all is almost always filed with the adult SFF. And
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'm thinking back to, like, when I was in high school, like, all of the sci-fi and fantasy dorks were all about the Forbidden Realms books. So, like
mm,
like, that was definitely, like and I think that the idea that books that are specifically for kids is something that's relatively new in a marketing thing in terms of, like, the narrow baskets of, like, kids this age to this age and this age to this age, and, like,
yeah,
it used to just be sort of like, here's the, like, picture book section and here's the, like, chapter book section. And, that has evolved as marketing has branched into these more granular, categories.
yeah. And then it's like as an author or as a small publisher trying to connect with these audiences, it's like who are you writing or publishing for? The readers or the marketers? Um,
And sometimes
yeah.
it's none of them.
Oh well. Okay. So yeah.
Anyways.
Yeah, that's okay. I feel like with this particular conversation going longer, we've sort of spiraled out from Mark Rigney's story, but I also feel like I don't know. I feel like I've said everything I would like to say about it. I mean, Matt, do you feel is there anything we missed or that you've thought of since you last spoke?
Um, I like that Rigney seems to be someone who thinks about symbols, and again, going to his thinking about him being a playwright, but also again thinking about this Moorcock stuff I just read, who's very big on symbols. But like just a simple thing of like introducing the tower, introducing the idea of story, introducing the pen, introducing these again symbols that then come back around, sort of recontextualized. And I think, again, I always try to think about like something I could take from a story and put in my own writing. It's like the importance of symbols and not being afraid to be like structural or like formulaic about it, because if you introduce that, you've got to consciously think to yourself, okay, well, I need to make sure it gets introduced here and it gets paid off here and it comes back around here. Like you've got to make those choices formally. So that's another thing that I liked about this. The ants is another motif that like comes back, which I thought was really interesting. Like the ants that
Yes.
sort of eat him or like attack him or in his little like self-flagellation stuff, and then the giant ants
I
that she has to
love that. He's like, I'm gonna tell you guys what's up, but first, cover me in ants.
well,
Yeah, that was
it's like it's the martyr move, like paint yourself
Mm,
out to be a victim and that you're willing to sacrifice for something, and like, you know
oh, yeah, and
uh
I think that it was also good because it was just so ghoulish. Like,
yeah,
it made him, like, undeniably creepy in a way that, like, it felt like the rest of the story had kind of it been inured to, and yet Danica was definitely like, this is really weird."
yes, and that's how you know the people are just gone, because they look at that and they're like, yeah, that's
That
normal
seems normal.
behavior
that
for
that
a
that means
person.
he knows things.
Yeah. I mean, he's
Oh
the
my
guy
god.
in Monty Python who's like weighing ducks for the witches or whatever. Like,
Yeah,
clearly
exactly. Like doing something
the
kind of
more
silly and
insidious.
strange, and therefore there's power in the strangeness. Yeah.
But I
Uh,
like all the symbols and all that stuff. And I mean, even the
mm,
ants has this idea of like masses and sort of
Hive mind.
like mass consciousness versus the
mm.
individualness of Dara, etc.
Yeah, good call. All right, Jay, was there anything that has been brought up that you just want to throw out at the end here?
No, I feel like we pretty much got everything I had on my list, as it were. This,
Okay, I'm just gonna say
this was great. I
that
really enjoyed it.
Yeah, no, this was a good one, I think. I certainly will just throw out one moment from the story that I really loved, which felt very like, oh yeah, I'm reading about a kid, was when Danica is trying to begin her journey to break in, and she sees a bunch of dead bodies, and then gets the impression they're going to get up and get her, and she's like, oh, I think this is an illusion. I know, and she rubs the like dead slugs into her face until she's so grossed out that she can't like focus enough to see the illusion or whatever. Like, am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah.
Yeah, she did do that.
Yes.
Yeah. So like I really 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 got a kick out of that because I actually had to reread it this time because I was like, wait, is there like a specific thing about slugs being anti-illusions? Or I was like, no, the kid's just grossed out and that and replacing one stimuli with another. Like awesome.
She also may or may not have killed her father. We don't really. I think she did. I feel like
that was. I feel like almost answering that question would have broken the bubble, though.
Yeah, because then she can't be like sort of innocent anymore after that.
Yeah, actually, that reminds me of a question I meant to ask. We're starting to run long, so let's I don't know, stick to the news headlines on it. But does this story feel over, or I mean, this particular tale is, but would you read Danica 2 Electric Boogaloo? Like, would you read more Danica? Does this feel like it would launch a series, perhaps a marketable series of novellas? I don't know, like, or does it feel like no, this works best as a one and done? Jay, you start.
Oh, for me, it's definitely a soap bubble. I would probably not want to revisit this character unless, like, the thing that happened to her at the end of this was somehow transformative. Like, something of this event, like, more so not, like, transformative, like, oh, like, obviously she's different now. But, like, the experiences that she's having here, like, I don't know. I think I like leaving it where it is, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, fair enough. And how about you, Matt?
I also think it's just the sort of one and done. Like again, it's the fairy tale thing where like it ends, and usually fairy tales end in a place where they a lot would happen after, but you can't do that because they would break the effect. Like you can't deal with the consequences in a real way because it would break the kind of fantasy of it. If Rigney were to return to Danica, I feel like he would have to jump like way in the future as she's dealing with like the trauma of whatever what she just went through. But no, I think it works best as a sort of like a fable. So it has a nice sort of closed kind of loop, and it sort of tells you like you're not supposed to think about the sort of like the realism here. Like that's not really the point. The point is the sort of like lessons or the morality that's baked into the thing.
Right on. I feel like I agree with you. If it was to continue, you'd want a time jump. I feel like if this is a story about, Danica as a tween, I want the next one to be at least her late teens. And maybe then make it a loose trilogy and have a third one, with her as a young adult or maybe an old crone. Let's really leap ahead. But I suspect that my desire for that is nothing to do with the story feeling incomplete. It is definitely a complete tale. It works fine as is, but I really liked it, so I want more Danica, and I find I have to be wary of that as a writer sometimes when I'm working on my own stuff, and I'm like, this can just be one story. It doesn't have to be more, even if I'm really enjoying it. Sometimes it's better to leave it as is. So speaking of leaving it, let's tie a bow on this one. I think this was a great chat. Again, thank you so much, Matt and Jay, for joining me for this. I really appreciated that. Thank you very much to Kevin for handling the technical side of recording this. We will have this up. Well, I guess if you're hearing this, it's either on YouTube or eventually thrown up as a bonus episode on the So I'm Running a Novel podcast, keeping the heart beating over there while I work on finishing the outline for the novel. So what's the next story chat going to be? Well, people have been asking me, when are you guys going to discuss a story from New Edge Sword Sorcery, which I've felt strange about up until this point, because, I'm the editor of the magazine, and also, what if I slip out some stuff that I shouldn't say about like the editing process or whatever that might, make an author irritated with me, maybe it's kind of dirty laundry to be like, oh, well, on this draft, but Christopher Rao, author and fan of the magazine, suggested something really cool on the New Edge Sword Sorcery Discord recently that I DM'd him later and was like, hey, what if we did this? And he's like, yeah. So I have his blessing, and he will probably join us for the panel in January on a Tuesday. We'll have to have it on a Tuesday. January 9th at 7 p.m. EST is when the recording /stage performance will be. So what's the exercise, Oliver? Well, we have been ever so lucky to get Michael Moorcock himself to write an original Elric tale, Folk of the Forest, which is in New Edge Sword Sorcery issue number 1. And that's pretty cool. Everybody else in the issues I'm very proud of as well, but for obvious reasons, it's an easy brag to say we have a Moorcock Elric story. And as far as I'm aware, certainly in published works, it is the most recent Elric story. And Christopher Rao was like, well, what if we did like a double bill? What if we read that, but also read the very first Elric story as it was very first published? I'm talking about The Dreaming City, which came out in 1961. And if you go back and read it as it was originally published, which can be found in PDF for free in various corners online, and not being shifty, it's old enough, it's been scanned a bunch of times, whatever it's done. Um, it's kind of neat. Like right in the first page, I found big differences between that and later versions of the story. I mean, Moorcock famously likes to go back and revise things before they get republished, as well as just interesting conflicts or whatever contrasts with the way the world of Elric would be realized later and Elric's characterization and all that. So yeah, for the next one, we're going to look at the very beginning of Elric and the I don't know if it'll be the end. Maybe there's more Elric coming, but certainly the current, most recent Elric, with about 61 years between them. I think that'll be kind of a fun exercise, and we need to see what we get into, not just in terms of the differences between the Elrics and the evolution of Michael Moorcock's. I shouldn't just call him Mike, but that's how he signs his emails. The evolution of Michael Moorcock's writing, but also maybe just talking about the pleasure of seeing characters and authors evolve over long stretches. Like I enjoy Stephen King, hot take, he's interesting. But mainly what I've enjoyed with him is his Dark Tower series because of how it stretches out over so much of his career that you can watch him evolve. So I think that could be a fun meta topic for the whole thing. Anyway, yeah, join us January 9th, 7 p.m. EST on the Discord if you're on there. And otherwise, it'll be tossed up on YouTube and then eventually the podcast after that. All right. Thanks again, Jay and Matt. And good night to y'all. Bye.
Take care.
Hi.